Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to my YouTube channel, The History Squad. Now, today's video is about a lady called Margaret Clitherow. She was from the Elizabethan age, the last part of the Tudors. She ended up being crushed to death, pressed as they called it, using her own front door. And what we're going to do, we're going to delve into her life and see how come she ended up dying in such a terrible way. Margaret Clitherow, born in the city of York, 1552. Her parents were Jane and Thomas Middleton. He was a wax chandler, dealt with all things to do with wax, candles, waterproofing, all of that kind of stuff. But he was also a freeman of the city of York. I'll explain about being a freeman a little bit later on. But it shows that she was born into a family that was, I suppose, middle class. Now, at the age of 18, she marries the widower, who's already got two sons, John Clitherow. Now, he was a wealthy butcher. They had a house in the Shambles in York, which is a great place to visit. Her house still stands, has a plaque outside. You can go in and see where Margaret Clitherow actually lived. Have a look at her front door as you go in. Now, John Clitherow himself, he was a freeman of the city of York, and it's important to know what a freeman did. He was responsible for who traded in the city of York, responsible for the strays that might wander into the city or escape, cattle, sheep. He also helped run the city itself. Now, on top of this, in 1574, John is voted in as a chamberlain of York. That means he has to do with the royal estates that are round about, or the royal interest, the finances of the royalty within York. So he's quite an important man. Now, Margaret and John had numerous children, but we don't know exactly how many they had and how many survived. But I can tell you this, she converted to Catholicism in 1574. So there's going to be a bit of friction there between her and her husband. This is a dangerous time to be a Catholic in England, the reign of Elizabeth I, that last part of the Tudors. In 1558, it was made illegal to harbour a priest. And then in 1559, there was the Act of Uniformity. So it was even illegal to have Catholic Mass. And in spite of all of this danger, Margaret actually harbours priests in her own home. She also makes available the sacraments to her neighbours and friends who want to practice their Catholicism in private, hold that mass, but it's totally illegal. Now, Margaret was so successful in the neighbourhood of spreading Catholicism that she comes to the attention of her neighbours, and her poor husband, John, he ends up getting fined, but it's his wife's doing because he remains Protestant. Now, there is an interesting piece from history that we've learnt about this, that he says to his wife that you are a fine, upstanding wife. There are only two things that bother me about you: your constant fasting, and you won't come to church with me to worship. One of the things about Margaret is, why did she convert to Catholicism? Now, there are a few differing stories, but the one that I've seen repeated was that it was a friend of hers who was a Catholic and told Margaret the stories of the Catholic martyrs, priests, burnt at the stake, hanged, all of those different things. And she became inspired by the sacrifice these people made for their beliefs in their religion. However, she ends up going to prison. But apparently the prison regime suited her lifestyle. She liked to fast, prison food, who wouldn't? And also she liked to spend time in prayer. Now, prison didn't do the trick. She didn't recant her Catholic faith. In fact, she learnt to read in prison. And once again, I've got two different stories. One is she learnt to read. The other is she learnt to read Latin. Now, upon her release, she makes a pilgrimage to Knavesmire, which is where the Tyburn tree, or the hanging place just outside of York, used to stand. Between 1582 and 1583, 5 priests, no less, 5 priests had been hanged at that Tyburn, and she made a pilgrimage to it to pray at the site where men had died for their faith. On the 10th of March 1586, the Clitherow house on the Shambles there in York is searched. Somebody has tipped off the authorities. They search the place, and a frightened child within the household shows them where the priest hole was. But the priest had gone. He'd had it on his toes. He was safely hidden next door in a neighbour's house. But you consider this modest house on the shambles. Wasn't very big, and yet Margaret had made a secret little chamber, a little room where a priest could hide. But now it had been found, and she's arrested. 2 days later, she appears at the assizes, charged with harbouring a Catholic priest. But she refuses to plea. She will not say guilty or not guilty. She refuses to be tried by a court with a jury. You do that, you fall foul of the common law of England. 1406, if you refuse to plea guilty or not guilty, you'll be subject to the hardest force of punishment that you can imagine. It's called Peine Forte. You're pressed to death. Now, I'm going to go into that in a little while. I've made some delicate models, I suppose you'd call it. Now, ministers of the Protestant faith, her husband, friends, all tried to persuade Margaret away from her path. Pretend you're pregnant. But there's some cases say she actually was pregnant at the time. The fact is they couldn't dissuade her. She's going to die in the most cruelest way you can imagine. Now, because Margaret refused to make a plea, she was executed on the 25th of March 1586. She was taken to the toll booth, which stood on the bridge, the Ouse Bridge. That's the bridge in York that goes over the River Ouse. She would have been stripped and then her modesty covered, splayed, as you can see here, her arms and legs tied out, and then her own front door, believe it or not, which would have been removed from her house, would be brought to the place of execution. Now, I have read that they took a sharpened stone, the size of the fist of a man, and placed it under the spine or the neck, so that when everything was pressed, it would hopefully snap the spine or the neck. Then what happened was the door would be placed on you, and then weights would be applied, and hopefully, as this was being done, you could actually make a plea. But Margaret didn't. She withstood the weight for 15 minutes. Apparently, what killed her was she was asphyxiated as the weight simply crushed in her chest. And then they left her there. This is something I can't quite get my head around. They simply left her there. The body was discovered a couple of weeks later by a friend, John Marsh. And then together with other friends, they took the body and she was buried with full Catholic rites. This death was awful. It was even used, the pressing, in the Americas, in the Salem witch trials. An 80-year-old man was pressed because he wouldn't make a plea. Do you know that stood as a punishment up until the late 1700s? Awful to think, isn't it? You're not going to plead guilty or not guilty. You're going to die. What happened after that? If you refused to make a plea, they said you were guilty anyhow. It's interesting to think that Margaret Clitherow's story doesn't end with her death. Her stepfather actually accused her of committing suicide, which is against the Catholic faith. You commit suicide, you end up in purgatory, you don't go to heaven. Others accused her of being mad, and then there was the rumours, was she pregnant, wasn't she pregnant? But her husband, John, he maintained his Protestant faith, but Margaret's rebellious streak when it comes to her religion must have rubbed off on two of her children at least, because one of them became a nun, the other became a priest. Her two stepsons were also inspired by Margaret's beliefs, because one of them becomes a priest and the other dies in Hull jail, imprisoned for his beliefs. The final piece of this tale of Margaret Clitherow's life is that she became a saint. 25th of October 1970, Saint Margaret. which I find quite interesting because 25th of October, St Crispin's Day. Cry God for Harry England and St George. However, there is a strange little thing that happened just after Margaret was executed, and it was a letter sent to the city and people of York, and it was from none other than Queen Elizabeth I. And she said that Margaret should have been spared the terrible fate on account of her gender alone. Don't forget, this was common law. It was the York Assizes. The whole business was dealt with by the city of York. On a finding out about this, it would appear that Queen Elizabeth herself was horrified at the terrible death of Margaret Clitherow. Well, that was a sad story. I hope it doesn't weigh too heavy on you. And to support my channel, if you could, like, share and subscribe, and turn on that all notification buttons if you can. And now just a quick shout out to a couple of my Patreon members, Trish McFerrin and Bishop Odo's nephew. How about that for a handle? Hey guys, thanks a million. Bye for now.